Hey! Okay, let's just skip the intro because you already know and I don't need to keep telling you every time. So, Roger Williams has just bought land for a colony from Massasoit. But before we get on with that, I must first tell you of the other men who came to help Roger Williams begin his new colony. For he was not alone in this great work. Their names were Thomas Harris, John Smith, not the famous John Smith of Virginia, Francis Wicks, and another Thomas. Not that Thomas. Get out of here. And another Thomas, Thomas Angel. The first Thomas, Mr. Harris, had come to Massachusetts a good 5 years after Roger had come there. He had been a neighbor of Roger's in Salem, but no one is really quite sure why he decided to leave with him to begin the new colony. We do know that Harris was a good friend of Roger's, though, sadly, things did not stay this way forever. But that's a story for another day. John Smith appears to be a figure with a story much like Roger's himself. He was a miller, and had worked at the Bay Colony's first grist mill, the Dorchester Mill. But grinding flour was not all he did. He too was unhappy about the tyranny of the General Court, and had actually written a book back in 1634 criticizing their behavior. Smith's book was burned, and he was banned from having any place in the government. Eventually, he was banished from the colony, just a month before Roger was, actually. But even though they were so much the same, Smith and Roger wouldn't stay such good friends forever either. As for Francis Wilkes and Thomas Angel, they were very young. Both of them were about 20 years old, an age that was not officially thought of as legally grown at the time. Wilkes was a servant of Mr. Smith and had worked at Dorchester Mill with him, and had naturally tagged along with his master on this expedition. Angel is a figure whom passing time has darkened a bit. Some think he may have been a servant too, but no one's quite sure, nor does anyone know why he came with Roger. With the help of these 4 men, Roger Williams had tilled the fields and sown the first seeds of his new colony. Things were going very well, and soon they began to think about bringing their families down. Until a letter arrived. It was a letter from the new governor of Plymouth, Edward Winslow, and he was informing the little group that they were on land that belonged to his colony. He wasn't really rude about the whole thing. He was actually rather polite and undemanding. But the message was clear. Roger was going to have to move. Perhaps you might find better land on the other bank of the Seekonk River, Winslow suggested. Of course, this was most unwelcome news to men who had just done planting fields. And truly, if anyone had a right to the land, it was them. Had they not fairly bought it from Massasoit? The Plymouth Pilgrims had not paid a penny for the land that they claimed. Roger was disappointed, but he didn't try to fight with Winslow. Instead, he and Thomas Angel got into a canoe and crossed the Seekonk to see what they could find. Just as soon as their little boat touched the opposite shore, Roger and Thomas were met by a group of Indians. These were members of the Narragansett tribe, and they greeted the 2 white men as friends. A promising first sign, and still more promising the quality of the land here. It was just as good as the land that Plymouth was claiming. Canonicus was the current chief of the Narragansett, and, of course, the owner of their land. Many years ago, when the white men had first come to his land, he was not at all pleased. It was the Plymouth settlers who had first arrived, and he had met them with 5,000 of his braves in battle array. The stories tell us that Canonicus then sent a snakeskin filled with arrows to William Bradford, who was governor of Plymouth at that time. And you'll notice I got it right this time. I didn't say Brewster. See, I get my act together sometimes. Anyway, he sent this as a sign of war. No doubt Bradford was a bit afraid of this great chief and his 5,000 men, but he didn't want to give up his colony. So Bradford took the arrows from the snakeskin, stuffed it instead with gunpowder and bullets, and sent it back to Canonicus. This caused quite a stir among the Indian braves and their chief. They had never seen weapons like these before. And when, after experimenting with the powder, they found that it exploded, they were terrified. They thought it must surely be some kind of evil magic. The Narragansett begged Canonicus to make peace with these strange and powerful palefaces. And so he did, and there had been peace between the two peoples ever since. It was this same Canonicus whom Roger came to now, and asked to purchase a place to settle. But Canonicus would not sell the land to him. Instead, he simply gave the land to Roger. Why he did this, we don't know. Perhaps the chief was surprised and touched by this white man, who actually offered to pay for what he took, instead of simply taking. Roger and Angel paddled back across the river to bring the wonderful news back to their waiting friends. They finally had a colony! Joyfully, the 5 adventurers embarked anew on their mission. Crops were planted again, this time actually to be enjoyed by the laborers, and small dwellings erected for each man, and for those who had one, their families, who would soon join them. A beautiful place, this gift of Canonicus, fitted with a freshwater spring and nestled comfortably in a cove. Good for farmland as well as trade. Roger named it Providence Plantations, because, in his own words, having a sense of God's merciful providence unto me in my distress, I called the place Providence, for I desired it might be a shelter for persons distressed for conscience.